I just want to say, I apologize for the lack of regular videos. There are times in which I wish I was just a NEET having way too much free time, but this harsh reality that I'm living in is giving me the role of a college student in its final semester working on his papers and moonlighting as some generic YouTuber rant sona that is only slightly less successful than any minimum wage jobs in America. And speaking of minimum wage jobs, today's video is going to be about the ongoing crunch culture happening in the gaming industry, why I think it happens, and what it tells us about the future of the industry. But before we get to the crunching, I want to say huge thanks for liking and sharing my videos, subscribing and following me on social media, and for supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, and many other means, links down below. It's rather insane in how many news we've heard about the crunching in a lot of the Western gaming industry. One of the most infamous crunches and abysmal management horror stories that we've heard was the one from Telltale, a crunch story so awful and horrific that the entire studio got closed, and at the time, the fate of their latest and final Walking Dead game is unknown. I've talked about that in another video. But then there are more horror stories that I didn't get the chance to talk about because once again, I'm busy and I think there are many other people who talk about this much better than I could. One of them is on BioWare's Anthem, a game that I noticeably haven't talked much about in this channel, even if it's one of the major titles of this year that caused a lot of backlash. There are many articles and horror stories detailing the rather brutal work crunch that's been happening throughout BioWare in the development of this game. One of the most famous articles that details this horrific story is the one by Kotaku. I'm not going to talk much about this article, but I do want to talk about the key points that are relevant to the discussion. First off, Anthem wasn't even the original name for the game. The original name for the game is Beyond, but they changed it in the last minute because it's difficult to secure the rights for it. No one actually knows what the game is all about until that E3 demo in June 2017, which is less than 2 years before the game actually came out, and the game didn't even enter production until the final 18 months, which caused people to leave the studio and having depression and anxiety. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You can read the article or just watch Young-Ya's video on it. So to put it short, Anthem's development cycle is basically me on the first couple of semesters in college, tons of procrastinating and working on projects in the last minute that I just couldn't be bothered with because I'm too busy playing video games at the time. Thankfully, I've gotten better somewhat, but the game industry hasn't gotten better as we hear more horror stories of crunching and poor management all around. Another one is from Epic Games, the developer of Fortnite and the wildly polarizing Epic Games Store. There have been more news about Epic Games Store since I last talked about it, but we'll talk about that in another video. Maybe, but for now, let's focus on the crunching. Fortnite, as you may know, is one of the most popular battle royale games of all time. Whether it's the best battle royale game is debatable, but that's not the point here. The point here is Fortnite's success has led to months of intense crunch at Epic Games, which is not surprising considering the number of updates that this game has, especially compared to its recent competitor Apex Legends, whose updates are so little that the game is on the verge of losing popularity. We'll get to that entire debacle in a bit. But the usual story is there. You have employees working 70 to 100 hours weeks. There's a lot of stressful and hostile working environments in which working overtime was expected, even though it's officially voluntary. The staffs were paid overtime, but there's a culture of fear amongst the developers in which they're expected to pull long hours as part of their job, which caused them to have health issues after working months of 70-hour week jobs. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the article contains more detailed testimonies from the individual anonymous developers. One of the testimony detailed in how the contractors are referred to as bodies. I mean, damn. It's rather ironic that a company that wants to support game developers with their Epic Games Store is also contributing on the horrendous crunch culture. But considering the success and growth that Fortnite has, I think anyone would be utterly powerless in being able to anticipate the level of success that the game has. And this brings me back to Apex. While Apex Legends get a lot of people playing on its initial launch days because it's a legitimately good and competitive battle royale shooter, the game is, well, dying. As illustrated by so many people like Critical and many other articles talking about these similar issues, Apex Legends is losing popularity, and the main issue that the game has is the lack of updates for pretty much anything really. Respawn essentially left the game and not care about it that much, so you don't see a lot of updates like new game modes or even fixing some of the fundamental issues such as glitches, cheaters, bad characters, etc. But don't worry guys, at least the characters are confirmed LGBT. And they're not kidding when they say that the game is dying. The game is just losing interest as highlighted by the declining worldwide search results on Google Trends. Now this happens to pretty much every game you can put on Google Trends, but what if you put something like Fortnite on it? Oof. That doesn't look good, does it? And what if you put something like PUBG, which is growing more popular outside of the US? Oof. Oh my lord, that's just painful. But that's not all. We also have Twitch metrics, which are just not very good. Apex Legends is dropping while Fortnite is still going steady. And all of this happens because Actually, it's for a good reason. It's because they want to maintain the health and well-beings of the developers. Some of the employees stated that they've been crunching since launch and that the Fortnite-style updates just isn't feasible for them. They don't want the same thing that happened to developers at Epic Games and many other studios to happen to them. So they delayed the updates, which comes at the cost of the game losing popularity and its players quitting. But at least the developers at Respawn and EA can sleep very well, knowing that they have time to sleep very well. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, obviously working on big game studios is pretty hard, time-consuming, low-paying, and will cause severe depression and anxiety to the average person. But another thing that we learn from all of this is that the whole business model of multiplayer-based games that receive constant updates is not sustainable in this industry without sacrificing the sanity of your workers. And if we put Telltale into the mix, the moral of the story turns into making the same game every year isn't really a good idea, whether your audiences got bored of the same tricks and your workers got so exhausted that the door is revolving so fast you can use it to cool down a CPU. There's this ongoing sentiment amongst the gaming media and the industry where traditional single-player games are not sustainable in this day and age. Games these days need to have multiplayer components and microtransactions so that they can keep generating those delicious revenues, because once somebody bought a single-player game, they're not gonna give us more money unless if we put in some DLCs for them. So let's ask them to give us more money by using utterly predatory methods of microtransactions. But what a lot of game developers and publishers need to acknowledge is that a lot of these benefits of sustainable revenue from the games as a service model comes with a huge price and an enormous responsibility to consider. Fortnite is not going to be sustainable if it weren't for the many hundreds of workers that sacrifice their time, blood, and sweat, and while Apex gained a breakthrough popularity amongst many gamers on its release, the game is dying because the studio doesn't want to put its employees to crunch. Now, I'm making it to sound as if crunching is essential for a lot of game developers and publishers to be able to sustain a lot of their games. Well, not really. It's not the crunching that needs to be better here. It's the management that needs to be better. The fault that Fortnite and Apex have is, ironically, being unexpectedly more popular than it was initially expected, and that sudden blast of popularity caused a lot of people in the development team to be confused in what to do with it. It's like trying to gather seawater using a bucket before being hit by a tsunami. Everyone is surprised about the popularity of these multiplayer battle royale games. I'm surprised that Fortnite was able to take over PUBG, at least in America, and I'm surprised that Apex is as popular as it is today. But the developers and publishers are about as equally surprised, and that shockwave of popularity is something that they're unable to manage and sustain. And I really can't blame them. It's not that healthy for developers to overestimate and expect their games to be a booming success, especially Apex. The ongoing crunch culture that is happening amongst the game developers and publishers today are caused by many factors. Utterly poor management, horrendous roadmaps, high expectations, and unexpected successes are just some of the most significant factors. There are many people who suggested that game developers should unionize, including the many popular gaming outlets out there. There are also some who disagrees because unionization is catering to a very specific political leaning, and any minor dissent might cause even worse problems for those who dare to speak, or that unionization might cause the workplace to be more competitive, and in result more work hours and more pain. Honestly, I don't have a lot of solutions to solve this problem, but as I am thinking about any possible solutions for it, I noticed something very concerning for the Western gaming market. So you have a bunch of workers being utterly depressed and suffering from anxiety thanks to the insane work hours and demands being given by the developers or the publishers. Usually when something like this happens, people tend to cut corners and try not to work too much on specific elements. The more people suffer from it, the more corners it cuts. And eventually the end result is not very good. Anthem is the prime example for this. I don't know how to solve this issue, but what I do know is this. Constant crunching and poor management will lead to the game industry to cut corners, and thus resulting in video games with much worse quality. If this crunch culture keeps on going, I see a dark future ahead for the Western gaming industry. The indies and the AA markets should be able to survive, but I doubt that the AAA gaming markets will be able to make good quality products in the future if this keeps on going. There are going to be some exceptions to the rule. I mean, Rockstar managed to make a well-beloved Red Dead Redemption 2 at the cost of I don't even want to start. But even amongst these minor exceptions, we still see developers suffering at the hands of poor management and crunch. This is not healthy, and something needs to be done about it if the Western gaming industry wants to improve. Now, forgive me for showing my bias towards the Japanese gaming industry, but How can I not? They're the ones making the good games these days that truly deserve praise. Sekiro, Devil May Cry 5, Ace Combat 7, and Resident Evil 2 are in my top favorite games of this year. Re-releases such as Tales of Vesperia and the Phoenix Wright trilogy are also some of my favorites this year. Now, we don't really know much about the working conditions in the studios of those games, but what I do know is that the Nintendo employees in Japan earn quite a lot and work less than 8 hours a day, although I attribute this more into Japan being one of the most overworked places in the whole world, which might result in more experienced workers and thus better management. So let me conclude with this. The Western gaming industry has so many issues, but the biggest issues of which is the crunch culture that might lead into cut corners, developers suffering and quitting the industry, and us the consumers will also suffer from it by having games with subpar quality. It doesn't always happen, but that still doesn't mean that this work culture and constant display of poor management are acceptable by any stretch of the imagination, and that still doesn't mean that we're gonna get good products in return. This entire thing makes me question not just the future of the Western gaming industry, but also the effectiveness of the brand new business models of turning games into a service. People need to be aware that even this business model comes with a lot of baggage that will be lumped to the poor workers of the industry. People need to be aware that a sustainable revenue needs someone or something to sustain it. And it's not always pretty. If more game developers and publishers are aware of the consequences of this new and popular business model, hopefully they will be discouraged at practicing it before we have more cases of game developers on the verge of killing themselves and games being populated by crappy Battle Royale knockoffs. Not you two, Persona 5. I don't know how to solve it. What? Oh, it's a brand new edition of the game. Oh god, I thought they're turning everything to Battle Royale these days. I heard they're turning FIFA to one too.